Okay, video 2 for chapter 13. For this section, I want to spend a bit less time. I already did that for the previous part, but I don't want to develop really important things for you to calculate, right? You're more likely to get theoretical questions here. There's some math questions you can get, but they will be related to things we've already seen, like the CAPM. So there's no new maths here in general. It's a lot more concepts and ideas and theories that I want you to think about. Okay, so when we come to capital budgeting and risk, I already said the answer or what we should do here when I started the first video is we should adjust the discount rate to take into account the risk level of a project. Okay, how can we do that? Right, there's multiple ways we can do that. I have 3 that are linked, that are discussed here, and I have a couple more in the background. Okay, the first thing, or in future slides, the first measure is probably my least favorite, but it is often used by a lot of people, is we can use qualitative measures. Right? We can have qualitative opinions about how much risk a project has, right? And we could use different discount rate based on how much risk we think a project has, right? If we think it's low risk, we use 6%. If we think it's moderate risk, we use 8%. If it's normal risk, we could use 10%, so on and so forth. And here I have also description of what these level of risk could be. Okay, so that's one of the measure we could do, one of the ways, right? We could use the WACC, the weighted average cost of capital. Let's say our weighted average cost of capital is 10%. When we do projects that are less risky than our normal project, well, then we should use a discount rate that is lower because there's less risk. We don't need to use, remember, right, the interest rate is the risk-free rate plus a risk premium. So if the risk is lower, the risk premium is lower, so we should use a lower discount rate. Okay, if the risk increase, if it's a completely new product in a related market, or if it's a completely new product in a completely different market, well, then maybe we should increase the discount rate that we use to account for this different risk. Okay, this is better than not doing anything to account for different riskiness of projects, but it's definitely not the best approach, right? However, if you're doing this and you don't have a lot of statistical or financial knowledge, maybe that's the best you can do, is just adjust for qualitative opinion on the riskiness of a project. Okay, 2 methods that are probably better, right? Actually, this is the same approach, right? It's called the pure play approach, so I probably should right? A better method, right, would probably be to use the CAPM to identify the appropriate discount rate. What should the discount rate is? The CAPM directly includes interest, right, payment. They're not exactly the same, the pure play approach and the CAPM, but they're pretty close. So basically the idea is I could find a company that is a pure play on what I'm trying to do. Right? Imagine that Ford, to come back to my example from the first video, wants to start a utility business. Right? They want to deliver electricity to people, so they want to start to get into the utility of electricity distribution and production. Right? They could try to find a company that is a pure play on that, on electricity distribution and production. Right? A company that only does that and does nothing else. Okay, if we do that, the cost of capital, the weighted average cost of capital on that company would represent the cost of capital that we should use, the interest rate that we should use in our NPV and IRR calculation. Alternatively, we could use the beta of that company, right? And we could use the CAPM to calculate the required return on projects from this company. Does that make sense for everyone? So the pure play approach is find a company that does exactly what we want to do, but only that, right? And then use that information, the information available from that company, to find the appropriate discount rate for the project we want to do. Now, this is easier said than done. Not a lot of companies in the real world are pure play, And often when companies are pure play, it doesn't mean that they're doing exactly like that. Might not be a pure play company in what you're trying to do or where you're trying to go, right? So this might be a bit harder done than I'm just saying here, but it's definitely a better approach if available than just using qualitative measures of risk. Okay. A different approach, and I do not want you to know how to do all of these calculations. Okay, I want you to get the general idea here. I will not ask you to make any of these calculations. An alternative approach would be to use the certainty equivalent method, right? We take all of our cash flows from the project and we modify them in a certain equivalent way. Okay, basically it's saying suppose you can have a cash flow of 500 or 600 or 800, right? You can have these values, but they're uncertain amount, right? There's some riskiness in these cash flows. How much would you be willing to accept, right, in exchange for that $500 if we stripped away all of the risk? How much would you be willing to get in exchange for that 500 if I took away all of the risk for you? Is basically how much are you willing to pay me for insurance, right? If you're willing to pay me $75 for insurance, it would mean that you would be willing to receive $425 with no risk, is equivalent to you as getting $500 with whatever level of risk that was, right? The certainty equivalent for the $600, right, is 480. It's saying you would be willing to pay me $120 to get rid of all the risk inherent in this cash flow. Okay, so the certainty equivalent method is to transform all of your cash flow in certain equivalent cash flows for which you would be indifferent between these cash flows and these cash with no risk. These ones here have no risk, and these cash flows with risk. Does that make sense? And then you just do your calculations, all of your calculation with the certainty equivalent amount with these numbers here. Which discount rate would you use if you do that? Stop the video now and try to think about it and try to use everything I told you about earlier to try to think of which, if you use these certain equivalent cash flow, these cash flows that have been stripped of all risk, which discount rate would you use? The weighted average at cost of capital, I don't know, just come up with the answer, right? Think about it, stop the video. Okay, the answer here should be, because these cash flows have no risk, the discount rate you should use is the risk-free rate, right? There's no risk inherent in these cash flows anymore. You should discount these cash flows. You should use the interest rate, the risk-free rate. So probably the government of Canada or the US government T-bill rate, right? 3 months T-bill rate. That would be probably your best interest rate to use, or you could use different maturities of bonds as your risk-free rate, but you should use that interest rate because there's no risk involved in here. That's the whole point of this lecture. That's the whole point of this class, is anytime you discount cash flows, you need to discount these cash flow with an interest rate that is appropriate to the level of riskiness of these cash flows. Does that make sense? So here, I don't want you to calculate this method. I don't want you to use this method. It's actually really hard, almost impossible, to find certainty equivalent payments, right? No one can easily calculate those. So this method is not actually really applicable. The reason I'm talking about it is because the concept of, if we could strip all of the risk from the cash flows, what discount rate should we use? Well, the one that has no risk, the risk-free discount rate. Does that make sense? This is the whole idea of this whole lecture. We should always use discount rate, right? Rate of returns that are proportionate to the amount of risk that we have. There's no risk in the project. These certainty equivalent payments here, there's no risk. I stripped away all risk, risk-free rate. Okay, a project that is riskier than what my business usually does, right? Ford Motors trying to launch a new computing companies, like to compete with Microsoft or Apple, right? Maybe high risk. Okay, maybe I can use the CAPM and figure out how risky those projects are and what interest rate I need to use to discount these projects. Does that make sense? So up to now, we always kind of assume the same level of riskiness, but that was a bad idea. Okay. You can ignore this slide about the certainty equivalent. It was for me to try to explain what the certainty equivalent is. Basically is the idea that how much would you take for certain instead of being offered a lottery, right? Here you're offered a lottery where you can get 5,000 50% of the time, or $0 50% of the time. So on average you'll get 2,500, right? How much would you take cash today in order to not have to go through this lottery? Because most people are risk averse, they would not want the $0. That makes them really unhappy, right? So they would be willing to take less on average than the average value of the lottery because they want to avoid at any cost that zero. They want some insurance against getting that zero. So let's say the person was willing to accept 2,000, that would be the certainty equivalent. Okay, but yeah, you don't need to be able to calculate that. Just understand the impact on interest rate and which interest rate you need to use. Okay, remember the one thing here that you might have to calculate, since the second video, is using the CAPM to calculate the required rate of return on the security of a certain companies, right? If you're using the pure play approach. So that's the only thing where you have to do calculation. I didn't give you an example because we did plenty of example already with the CAPM, so I hope this is understood. If it's not, you should talk to me. Okay, so this is talking in general. This was talking in general about which interest rate we should use when we do capital budgeting projects. These are different method or different things that are a little bit related but are not exactly the same. The first one is about Monte Carlo simulation. This is something we can do when we analyze a capital budgeting project in order to make sure that or to understand the level of riskiness of that project. Okay, I don't know, so feel free to send me feedback either by email or during the check-ins and things like that about how clear you find this material, because I've never taught it online and I kind of use a lot of back and forth to teach it usually. So feel free to kind of tell me, for instance, this was really not clear just online, or it was really clear and I understood it. Okay, in order to do Monte Carlo simulation, basically what we do here is we're going to use a computer program to run millions, hundreds of thousands, or tens of millions of NPV calculation or IRR calculation. Okay, so we're going to use a computer program to run millions of those, all of them with different parameters that are selected randomly. Okay, and then I'm going to use that to calculate a whole bunch of NPV, and then I can get the distribution of the return that this project, let's say the distribution of the NPV that this project can give me. So I'll get something like that that will tell me like, oh, 5% of the time this is going to be the NPV of the project. Oh, 50% of the time this is going to be the NPV of the project. So on and so forth. So that I'm going to have a better idea of how risky the project is. Okay, now you don't need to do this in person. If you do more finance, if you go further, you're probably going to have to do this, but I don't think they'll make you ever do this in undergrad, but you should understand what it is, because someone might use that in your firm in the future, especially if you work for bigger firms, and you should understand what they did, right? Now I don't expect that with just this class you're going to run this, so I just expect you to understand what it is. So how do we do a Monte Carlo simulation? 5 steps. Okay, the first step is define a domain for all of the inputs, right? In your NPV calculation, when you're doing your NPV calculation, you're probably going to have estimate of which quantity we're going to sell, right? You're probably going to have estimates of that probably will come from the marketing department, right? We think we will sell this many units, of what price we think the good will sell for, and how confident we are about that. So what we're going to do is we're going to define, right, a distribution for all these variables, right? Oh, the price is normally distributed with a mean of 25 and a standard deviation of 2, right? The quantity that we will sell is uniformly distributed between 100,000 and 150,000 units. So we're going to define distribution for all of these variables that will affect our calculation. Okay, but these variables, these values are going to be random, right? They're going to be the result. They're going to be basically, we're going to draw a random variable. We're just going to draw one number out of these distribution each time. Okay, now once we define the domain for our input, we're going to generate random numbers from the distribution we described in 1, right? So the price is normally distributed. I don't remember the mean and the standard deviation I gave you, but I'm going to draw randomly a number in that distribution. We can easily draw random numbers using computer program nowadays, and no one would probably do that ever on Excel. But just to show you here, right, if I go on Excel, I can easily draw a random number, right, between 0 and 1. This is from a uniform distribution between 0 and 1. Then I can use that number to find the value of my variable, right? If my my price was following a normal distribution with a mean of 25, I would say this is the probability that I got. The mean was 25 and the standard deviation was 2, right? Give me a random value. Oh, the price was 21.70 for this simulation. Does that make sense? I would do that for the price. I would do that for the quantity. I would do that for the cost per unit. I would do that for the marketing cost. I do that for all the variables. I define all of these variables in step 1. I define out of what distribution they would be drawn, and then I just draw random numbers. Okay. So that's what I do in number 2. I just generate random numbers from all of these variable that I define in step 1. Okay. After that, step 3. Well, now I have my price, I have my cost per unit, I have my units sold, I have all of this information. I drew them. I drew actual number in step 2. In step 3, I'm going to use all of these numbers to do NPV calculation, right? I'm just going to set the program up to just do those calculation by itself. Okay, and it's going to calculate the NPV for me, or it's going to calculate the IRR for me. Okay, once I've done this, well, I just repeat step 2 and 3 1 million times. I just ask the computer to calculate the NPV 1 million times. Every single time I'm going to have different numbers, right? I'm going to restart at step 2, so I'm going to redraw random numbers from my distributions, right, for the price, for the cost of goods sold, for this, for that. So I'm going to redraw all these random numbers, and I'm going to get millions of NPV calculated. These millions of NPV calculated will take into account the uncertainty that we have about these variables, right, the price, the quantity sold, so on and so forth. And after that, well, we can just aggregate the result, right? We can make a distribution, right? What's the probability of getting different NPVs? We can calculate the standard deviation, the average NPV, so on and so forth, and we can use that to enlighten our step and our decision. And this is a lot better than making only one NPV calculation because it's taking into account the inherent risk of the project and what we consider to be the riskiness of the project, right? And it's taking all of these variables changing at the same time. So we're looking at millions of possible scenarios. And with the aid of a computer, this takes mere like maybe 30 minutes to do. This is really quick to do because computers can just iteratively run these kind of simulation, right? So this is kind of a graphical interpretation of this in the book. I don't love it, but basically, right, we have a sales forecast, we have operating cost forecast, fixed cost forecast, cash flow, cost of capital. We have distributions, not forecasts, but distributions for all these things, right? So in step 1, we define that distribution. In step 1, we define that green distribution. We define that distribution. We define all of these distributions, okay, in step 1. Then in step 2, the program will choose one random value. So it will choose a value where there's a dotted line here, 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 here. It chooses all these values for these different variables. Then in step 3, the program will calculate one NPV, NPVs here, given all of these values. So we get this NPV here, and this is really weird. They put it at 0, but it wouldn't have to be 0. It could be positive or negative, right? But it will give us one value, one NPV here. Does that make sense? And then we just rerun this program 1 million times, and then we're going to get a distribution of NPVs. How often different NPVs occurs, and we'll be able to find the probability of occurrence, we'll be able to find the expected value, the standard deviation, everything we want. Okay? And that's going to take into account the risk. Okay, so that's a Monte Carlo simulation. It's one way to adjust for risk. Again, I'm not expecting you to do any of this by yourself. I'm not expecting you to be even able to like pick a value out of a normal distribution, right? Say like, oh, the average is 25, the standard deviation is 2. I pick a random number, that's the number I get. I pick a different random number, right? I get different numbers. They're all centered around 25, roughly, with a standard deviation. Right? I don't expect you to do this, okay, or understand this. I think I would need to make sure that everyone has a stats background and everyone has a little bit of programming background, or I would have to spend a lot of time doing some programming. So I don't want to tell you exactly how to do that, but I think it's important to understand the steps and be able to explain them to me. Is that good? So I spent a lot of time doing that. Hopefully that's fine. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is the portfolio effect. Okay, I think I'm going to skip most of these slides, and I'm just going to go with the Blackboard here. That's basically, I'm going to be using this slide mostly. Okay, but this is usually how I show it in class, mostly focusing on this part. Okay. Suppose, right, and this is a bit better drawn here, so I'll start here. Suppose we draw the risk level on the horizontal axis here, and we draw the rate of return here. Okay. Suppose that I have two securities, right? Suppose we have BMO as a company, and they sell common share. We know that BMO has a relatively low risk level, right? And a relatively low expected rate of return. And then we take another company like Bombardier now, right, which is probably pretty risky, but probably means you have a pretty high expected rate of return, right? Now some people will say, well, Francis, no, Bombardier is like about to fail or whatever, but for that reason you get a really high expected rate of return, right? If you think Bombardier is going to fail, how are you going to be motivated to buy Bombardier shares? Only if the share price is really low, and if they manage to turn the situation around, then they do a ton of cash, right? And you get really rich in the process. So high risk and high expected return, right? The idea here is if we wanted to, you don't have to just buy shares of BMO or shares of Bombardier. You can actually combine them into a portfolio, right? And what kind of rate of return could you get if you combine these two shares together in one portfolio? Okay, the answer to that question will depend on something that we call in stat the correlation. Correlation. Sorry for my poor writing on the board here, but it depends on correlation between these two things. Okay, the correlation between two variables will always be between 0. It's not between 0, between -1 and between and 1. Okay, correlation is always between -1 and 1. Okay, if the correlation is 1, it means that when one variable goes up, the other one goes up. So when the rate of return on shares of Bombardier that was here goes up, the rate of return on shares of BMO goes up. Okay, the rate of return on the shares of BMO goes up slower because there's less risk, right? Remember, my risk is here. Then the share of Bombardier go up, but they both go up at the same time, right? This is the expected return here. Whoa, so bad. Sorry. If the correlation is positive, well, then they both move in the same way, right? I'll just scrap that and redo a graph here. Suppose I have the return on BMO here, and I have the return on Bombardier. I'll just call it bomb. Sorry about that, but it's too long otherwise, right? If I draw, right, in 1 year in 1990, the return of BMO was here, this percentage, right? This is 0, so it was positive in 19 for BMO, and the rate of return for Bombardier was here, right? In 1991, it was here. In 1992, it was here. In 1993, it was here, so on and so forth. And I just draw all of these together on a graph, right? The correlation will use all of these points, right? And we'll try to basically draw a straight line through these points. Okay? If all of the points were straight on the line, if all of the points I drew earlier had been right on the line, this would be a correlation of +1. Okay? When the value of the return on BMO goes up, the value of the return on Bombardier also goes up. On the other end, if the correlation was -1, basically we would, wow, I should not have drawn this that way. I'm sorry. I should have used a smaller pen size. But if the correlation was -1, the observation would all be on this straight line here, and it would be negatively related. So when the return on BMO goes up, the return on Bombardier goes down. Okay, so there's a negative correlation between the two. They move in different direction. When the correlation is positive, they move in the same direction. Okay, now if we had a correlation that is like 0.7 positive, then maybe it would look something like this. Right, and a straight line would go here. That would be a correlation maybe of 0.7 positive. So when the return on Bombardier goes up, the return on BMO goes up, the return on Bombardier also goes up, but it's not a one-to-one relationship. Okay, there's some kind of lock here, and there's some kind of uncertainty that goes on. Okay, it would be 0 if there's no relationship at all between these two variables. They would be -1 if they're negatively related, as I just showed earlier. Okay, so where I started, let's get back to the beginning with all this. Where I started is I can draw these 3 points. I could put the risk here, right? Either standard deviation or beta. I could put the expected return here, right? And I have my two security BMO here and Bombardier here. Now what's interesting is if the correlation between these two security is exactly 1, okay, I can find all of the combination I could get using these two securities in my portfolio of expected return and risk. Okay, and I would just draw a straight line. Goodness, it's so hard not using a board. I would just draw a straight line through these 2 points. Okay, and that would be basically all the possible portfolio if the correlation was +1, right? So with a correlation of +1, okay, all of these portfolios would be possible. I could get a portfolio right in the middle here between this point and this point. I could get a portfolio here. Take a second and try to think, what is that portfolio? Can you think about it? Stop the video for a second and think about it. This would be a video, a portfolio, So it would be a portfolio where I own 50% of my portfolio in shares of BMO. BMO was here, right? And 50% in shares of Bombardier. I could pick a portfolio that would be here, right on this point. What would be that portfolio? Stop the video and think about it. Okay, well, that portfolio here that we were talking about would be roughly 80% on Bombardier, right? I'm closer to Bombardier. I put about roughly 75-80% of my wealth in Bombardier, and I put 25 in BMO. Okay, this portfolio here would also be possible. How would I achieve that portfolio? Stop the video right now and try to tell me how I would achieve that portfolio. That portfolio here would be achieved by going long more than 100% on Bombardier and going short BMO. Maybe in my portfolio I put a 120% of my wealth in Bombardier, but I can't have 120% of my wealth. So what did I do is I put minus 20% of my wealth in BMO. This is called in finance terms called shorting BMO. I shorted BMO. I sold shares of BMOs that I don't have in order to buy shares of Bombardier. Okay, there should be an R to Bombardier. Makes sense for everyone? And what's this portfolio here? This one should be really easy. How much of your wealth do you put in Bombardier and BMO if you have this portfolio here? Well, that's exactly what shares of Bombardier would give you, so that's 100% of your wealth has been put in Bombardier. Okay. The idea here is there's actually not a lot of benefits of diversification when correlation is 1. Okay. You might want to buy shares of BMO. You might want to buy shares of Bombardier, but that's going to depend on your risk preference. Right? All of these portfolios, any of these portfolios here are all valid portfolios, and they just depend, all of the one of these lines, they all just depend on what your risk tolerance is. Some people are willing to take a lot of risk and get a high rate of return, but the correlation doesn't give you, because the correlation is 1, we don't get any benefit from diversification. Now let's try something different. Suppose we have the same two security, Bombardier and BMO. Again, right? BMO is roughly here, Bombardier is roughly here. Suppose that the correlation is smaller than 1. It goes down to 0.7. Okay? What would happen is now the line that we drew earlier wouldn't be a straight line. It would start to arc like this. Okay, and this would be, let's say, with a correlation of 0.7. Okay, the correlation could keep going down. It could go to 0.5, 0.2, 0, minus 0.1, minus 0.2. And as the correlation keeps decreasing, this line, and I'll do the next one in a different color, would just keep getting more and more. I guess this would be convex like that. It shouldn't go back down here, by the way. You can't get lower return for higher risk. It shouldn't go back down. It should become like more horizontal. Okay, it's just really hard for me to draw here. But basically this line will just keep going like this. Okay, until when we get a correlation of exactly -1, the line will be a straight line that goes like this and goes here. And obviously here the green line shouldn't cross the blue one. The blue one should always be like in between the green and the red light, in between here, and it's just this part is kind of just pushing out. Does that make sense for everyone? Okay, that's what I'm trying to say. Now this is super interesting. Okay, this starts being really interesting, but that's only happening when the correlation is not 1. And the further negative the correlation is negative, the more interesting it becomes. If we have a -1 correlation, this is amazing. Okay, look at what can happen here. What's specific about this portfolio, right? Remember, this axis here is the expected rate of return, and this axis here is a measure of risk, let's say standard deviation. How much risk is there on this portfolio here if you buy this portfolio? There's 0 risk. Okay, whenever you have two securities with perfectly negative correlation, that are perfectly negatively correlated, they don't have they have like -1 correlation, you can always create a portfolio that will have 0 risk, right? So you created a new risk-free asset. Boom, right here. Okay, so this is what the essence of this slide here is saying. When you have -1 correlation, you can get significant risk reduction. Okay, when you have a correlation of 0, you can get some risk reduction, and when you have a correlation of +1, you get no risk reduction at all. Okay, you can't do anything. With +0.5, well, you get some risk reduction, but not as much. Okay, so that's a really important concept. It's the idea that as the correlation between different securities increase, we can reduce risk by having a mix of different securities. Okay, so for example, If I redo the graph, right, we have BMO, we have Bombardier, and I don't know, we find the correlation. Great drawing, Francis. Let's say Bombardier was here all along. Okay, it's easier to me redoing the whole graph. This is the actual combination of portfolio I can get with a given correlation, right? Our correlation is 0.3. Okay, this is the actual combination. Now this is interesting because we're going to find that some portfolio are strictly worse than other. Think about this portfolio here and compare it with this portfolio here. Which one would you prefer to get? Remember, this is expected return and this is risk, right? Well, look, the two portfolio have the same risk, but one gives you a higher rate of return for the same risk. Would you prefer to get more rate of return or lower rate of return for a given risk? So this portfolio strictly dominates this portfolio here. And so now we're starting to have portfolios that are completely useless, that no one should be investing in because they're just strictly worse, strictly dominated by other portfolio. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to stop this here. I could talk a lot about this. I love this part. I think that I shouldn't take you too far down the rabbit hole here. One thing you need to understand is how this line, right, this line that I drew here is affected by diversification and by mostly by the different correlation. What happens when the correlation between the two security change? Okay, that's the first thing you should understand. The second thing you should understand is that this understanding that by having diversification, right, by having this go out like this, we're able to get higher return and lower risk, right? We can get higher return at the same risk, or we can basically remove risk for higher or similar rate of return, and that should be good, right? That should be something that we're looking for. Higher risk for higher return for lower risk. Whenever in this graph we move to the left or we move up or diagonally that way, that's good, right? Moving straight up, we get a higher rate of return for the same risk. That's good. Moving straight left, we get the same rate of return for lower risk. That's better, right? So any time we move in these directions, that's good, right? The portfolio to the left or up from another portfolio are always strictly dominant. So that's the second thing you should understand. Okay. The third thing you should understand is how this applies to business. Now, this is mostly an investment subject, right? And if you're interested in this, we'll talk about that more in investment. In terms of corporate finance, why do we care about this? Here's the reason. We have two alternatives, right? We could decide to produce only one thing, do it really well. Okay? If we do that, we don't have any benefits for diversification, right? If we just do one thing really well, right, and then something like COVID strikes, and we only have one line of business and we do it really well, and that line of business gets decimated by COVID, we're screwed, right? We have no diversification. If we do a lot of different things, then maybe we can have diversification, and while one business is hurting, the other one is doing well. Hey, what does that mean? One is hurting, the other one is doing well. What does that mean in terms of correlation? Stop the video and think about that. Right? That means that the correlation is negative, right? When one line of business hurts, the other one does well. When the other one does poorly, the other one does well. So it just keeps alternating like that. If that's true, then we have negative correlation and we can get some benefit from diversification. Okay, so there's two schools of thought here, and I'm not going to tell you what you should do because I think it's going to depend a lot who you work for. If you work for smaller firms, right, mom and pop shops, maybe they would like to have some diversification in their portfolio. Maybe they would like it to one of their business as a negative correlation with the other business, and that they get some safety in a bad economic environment and some safety in a good economic environment. Right? They get some good income in both cases. If you work for a corporation, the consensus tend to be that firms should not diversify. Ford Motor should not diversify. What Ford Motor should do is become the best producers and seller of cars in the world. It should concentrate on that core business and then investors should diversify, but firms shouldn't diversify. Okay, so that's the third point you should understand, right? Is that this is also applicable to business. Now I just talked about it from this securities point of view, right? If you want to buy shares of Bombardier or shares of BMO, but now you could think about this as this is an example I used in an exam a couple years back, right? But you were working for a small company. The owner was selling luxury living room furnitures, right? And the owner wanted to make sure that he wouldn't be negatively affected. He wanted to start a new business. He had enough income and enough time to start a new business, and he wanted to make sure that his two business wouldn't be so affected, right? If one business did poorly, like, it was really important for the owner to maintain a certain level of living, right? And then I ask you, well, he's selling luxury living room furniture. What do you think he should expand into? He has two ideas that he proposed to you: high-end kitchen appliance, or second-hand living room furniture. Which one do you think is the best? Okay, and the answer here was the second-hand living room furniture. Because if he's worried, if his idea and what he's worried about is loss of income, he wants to take another business that is complementary, that has negative correlation with his primary business, right? If he's selling luxury furniture, living room furniture, and he sells low-hand living room furniture, second-hand living room furnitures, when the market's not doing well, when the markets go down, do you think people buy luxury furniture? No, probably not. Okay, when there's a recession. Do you think they buy more second-hand furniture? Yes, probably. There's a negative correlation here. And when one side of the business is doing poorly, the other one will be doing well, and he will get some benefit from diversification. And this is why I talked about all of this in this class, so you can think about my third point, right? How can we use this in corporate finance? We can use this by thinking about the impact on a business of diversification, right? Diversification will be good for reducing risk for a business if there's negative correlation between the two business. If there is not negative correlation, then there's not a lot of benefit from diversification, and we can think about this diversification also in the term more of small firms, right? Mom and pop shops. How can they reduce risk? By doing different business, by investing in different business. Again, I said most people in corporate finance agree today that corporations shouldn't diversify themselves. Investors should, right? That doesn't really apply though for small businesses. It applies for big corporations like BMO or Ford Motors or a pharmaceutical company. Okay, that's all I had to say. There's not a lot of maths in this video. I know you hate theory. I'm sorry. I think some of these concepts were important to think about and to talk about. Yeah, and they're definitely going to be tested in the exam, but this is where I'm going to stop for this week. Next week, exam on Tuesday. Good luck with that. Your first one went really well, so hopefully this one goes well too.